Dr. Hudson, with over 3 decades of experience in higher education, is a dedicated advocate for creating inclusive and welcoming spaces, particularly for those who have faced discrimination and marginalization. Currently serving as the Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Everett Community College, Dr. Hudson previously led the Center for Diversity and Inclusion at the University of Houston downtown. Under his guidance, the center became a pioneer in promoting inclusivity on a diverse campus, earning 3 consecutive higher education excellence and diversity awards. Dr. Hudson's academic journey and research focuses on LGBTQ and minority representation, emphasizing on the importance of anti-bias and inclusive education. But beyond his professional accomplishments, he's achieved a remarkable feat in powerlifting, earning a place in the Double 700 Club of the World Association of Benchers and Deadlifters. With a passion for literature, Dr. Hudson's favorite childhood book is The Little Engine That Could, and he starts his mornings with a kick of energy from Zero Coke. Furthermore, his enduring inspiration comes from the song Fooling Yourself by Styx, which has resonated with him since middle school.
Thank you for that introduction. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to speak with you this morning on a topic that's very, very important. And I can tell you, if you've read the description of my topic on the website, that's not quite what I'm going to talk about because 2 months ago, I was asked to talk about supporting Muslim students on campus. And I'll tell you a little bit about how I became so involved in doing that, going back to my PhD studies and working at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. As I started to work on my remarks, of course, events took a turn that really changed a lot of things about what I wanted to talk about. And that was specifically the events of October 7th in Israel and the following response by Israel in Palestine. So I'm not going to be talking specifically about what is going on there because I want to keep our focus on what we need to do, can do, must do on our campuses because things are becoming very, very serious for a variety of reasons. And if you've been watching the news on campuses around the country, there is a lot of protest. Campuses in the United States have traditionally been sites of protest, political expression, freedom of speech, and those are all good things, much to be proud of. However, on occasion, some of that expression spills over into violence. And then more widespread is a feeling among certain groups of students at various times of fear, of a lack of safety, and also a lack of voice, a lack of visibility, and a variety of other problems associated with that. So I want to situate my experience very briefly, and that is I have seen in my years in higher education, some of which were overseas, so I missed some of the events in the US during those years, but there were 2 prior to this year events where I saw a pattern emerge in terms of how Muslim students are treated at times of crisis. And I would also say that many of my suggestions and recommendations that I'm going to get to today are applicable widely for a variety of marginalized groups on our campuses, as I think you're going to see. Principally, 9/11, that's an event that is forever etched in the minds of those of us who witnessed it and lived through it. I know we're at a time now where there are some students on campus who are too young to have actually seen and processed what was going on our screens. But what happened following 9/11 was very difficult. Not just the tragedy of the event, but the response of people in the US. Violence against people who were perceived to be Muslim, perceived to be Middle Eastern, rose in the months following 9/11 by 1,547%, if I get my number correct. But it was not limited simply to people who were actually Muslim or Middle Eastern. It was very widespread in that South Asian folks were subject to attack. People of Hispanic descent were subject to attack. I know of Native Americans who were subject to attack. There were Sikhs who were actually killed following 9/11. So what we saw was a process of what some have identified as racialization. So combination of anger, reactionary behavior, and stereotyping, whereby suddenly a group becomes racialized, and anyone associated with that group, or this racialization builds on stereotypes. And so typically people who are targeted were males, women wearing hijab, and people with brown skin. Those were the three patterns that you see very widely across the crimes that were committed following 9/11. After a few years, things kind of dropped back to some sort of normal, not what I would call acceptable, but the vitriol following 9/11 diminished. But in 2017, we had another thing that came along that sort of reignited this, and that was President Trump's executive order of January 27th, 2017, that came to be called the Muslim travel ban. And this was a restriction on travel and immigration from Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen. So this was met with widespread protests. It was challenged in court. The Supreme Court on June 26, 2018, upheld the ban on a 5-4 decision. And there's a third version of that executive order was signed later that expanded the ban to other countries. Some of them not Muslim countries, but there are still remnants of that ban that are still on the books. That brings us to October 7th, because what we saw following 9/11, we also saw, to a lesser extent, but still deadly in some cases, and more importantly, on campuses, creating an atmosphere of fear in 2017. We see that happening again following October 7th. And so we have to look at our campus communities and make sure that we are ready to support students who feel under threat, who feel silenced, who feel afraid. There's a complication to this, because what we see happening in the news is unlikely to diminish in the short term. This will likely continue for a while. And it's at a time where we're about to enter a presidential election year. So that's significant, because the last two presidential election cycles were distinguished by being particularly difficult in terms of some of the language that came out of the campaigns. In 2016, there was a lot of targeting of migrants and immigrants. And in 2020, that was diminished somewhat thanks to the pandemic in an odd way, but it was still present on our campus in 2016, where we have at any given time at the University of Houston downtown, roughly 500 to 600 undocumented students, and more than 2,000 students who come from families where they have household members who are undocumented, and an even larger number who come from immigrant families. It was a scary time, particularly being in a city in Texas, which has been in the news quite frequently in recent years around the issue of immigration. So this, to add another difficulty to it, a recent Gallup poll indicates that around 10% of the voting population feels that political violence can be justified. in the United States. That's a scary thought. Now, it's not without historical precedent. In my free time, one of the things I enjoy doing is reading history, and was recently reading a biography of John Marshall, who's one of the really important Chief Justices of the Supreme Court in the early years of the United States. But what you find is political violence has actually been part of American politics for a long, long time. We just don't talk about it that much. We like to talk about, particularly when we're telling folks from other countries, what our society is like, what our values are, what our country stands for. We're very good at doing that. What we're less good at doing is putting that microscope on ourselves and asking a question that I heard Cornel West ask at one time that made such an impression on me. He asked, what kind of a society are we really? And he asked that question, and there was dead silence. Because when we really think about that, we see that as a society, we have tremendous gulf in some areas between our stated values and the actual lived experience of people in their day-to-day lives. In the same way, all of us who are in higher education, we live and work and study in what are a kind of microcosm of society in some ways, although a little bit different, because the fact that we're all here on a college campus, educating, being educated, learning from each other, we're in kind of a privileged bubble in many, many ways that provides protections that a lot of folks around the country just don't have. And we forget about that. But we need to keep that in mind. And at the same time, though, we need to look at what our campus communities are really like. What kind of campus community, if you think about your campus, what kind of campus community are we really? So each of our campuses has our stated values. We have our strategic plans, which among community colleges in the state of Washington, and by the way, Washington is leading the nation right now in terms of working for equity, social justice, anti-racist education in higher education, way ahead of almost all other states. So, and community colleges in particular, all 34, community and technical colleges in recent years, thanks to Senate Bills 5194 and 5227, have revamped their strategic plans with an effort to center equity in all of the strategic plans. Whereas if you look around the country at strategic plans for colleges and universities, diversity, equity, inclusion are often added kind of as an afterthought. They're not integrated into the strategic plans. A lot of our community colleges now have equity centered, and then the rest of the strategic plan built around it. That is very aspirational because it's sets the bar extremely high, which is a good thing because it's going to keep us working to achieve equity. Along with that, I think one of the really wonderful things about the values in a lot of campuses following those bills is the focus on belonging. That's one of the things that really attracted me to this position here at Everett Community College. Belonging is so important. It was a transformative experience for me in two ways. Number one, my early undergraduate years in the 1980s, when I felt I didn't belong, having just come out to my family and then come out to a few friends, but this was the 1980s. I was a freshman in 1983. This was during what we used to call the AIDS crisis, when we didn't understand HIV. And there was violence against particularly gay men or perceived gay men because of anger over HIV/AIDS. And so it was a difficult time. The police would not help us if we were attacked or we were harassed. In fact, sometimes in many places they were part of the problem. So that lack of belonging, that sense of going day to day and looking over your shoulder, not wanting to walk across campus at night, fearing for your safety. And I was a member of the wrestling team too. So a lot of people would think, why would you feel unsafe? But I did. That was a constant in those years. And then coming back to finish my PhD after working overseas on a campus where I did feel I belonged, that was transformative for me. And while I look back and remember, I felt I belonged at University of Illinois when I was working on my PhD. I know a lot of students did not. And among those who did not were Muslim students and students perceived to be Muslim or Middle Eastern following 9/11, because that was during that time. So when we look at our campuses, what do we need to do to be prepared, not just now, but going into this election cycle, when we can be pretty sure that there's going to be some unfortunate use of language and stereotypes in the media, and we want to be proactive and also supportive and responsive to help kind of alleviate as much of that burden as we can while keeping our campuses not just safe, but trying our best to make sure our campus community members can study, can work, can live in free from fear. There's a big difference between making a space safe and being free from fear. You can be in a safe space and still experience fear. That's a big gap between the two, and it takes a lot of work to close that gap. And that fear is an enormous weight. And I think many of you would agree with me that everyone on our campuses are entitled to be free from fear. And that too is aspirational. For us to actually achieve that in practice is difficult, but good things, positive things, worthwhile things are seldom easy. So this is something we really need to put our shoulders to and work together to achieve. So what are some of the things that we could do as we look at what's happening now and going into the presidential election year? And then, on my news feed this morning when I woke up, this article came up from the Washington Post that was published October 31st. The headline is "Colleges Braced for Anti-Semitism and Violence. It's Happening," with this subline that somebody says, "I had Jewish blood on my hands," a Tulane student said after aiding a classmate who was assaulted at a pro-Palestinian rally. So other than some of the possible problems with the way the title comes across, the article itself is actually quite good and identifies that it's not just anti-Semitism, but it's Islamophobia, it's anti-immigrant sentiment. It is that's particularly directed at people who are perceived to be from the Middle East, as well as violence between people of different opinions about what they see in the news. So violence simply has no place on our campuses. We, of all people, should be modeling civil dialogue. Civil dialogue is one of those things that's also not easy. When you feel strongly, when you feel righteously justified in what your opinion is, you can get kind of energetic about that. And yet, we have never been at a point in the history of this country where we have needed civil dialogue as badly as we do now. And in my opinion, the best place to model civil dialogue is on our campuses. If we really walk the talk of our values on campus around civil dialogue, imagine that we graduate a whole generation of future leaders committed to civil dialogue as they go into corporate work, nonprofit work, government, in other facets of our society. That's transformative. And we need that so very badly because, as you know, some of the dialogue around the political process today is very uncivil. And so we have to model that and we have to practice that. And our campuses are great places to practice those skills. And civil dialogue is a skill. And as I said, it's not an easy one. I know that very much from my activist experience, particularly in the past when I had a slightly hotter temper than I have now. But one of the things I think we should zero in on is something that I hear students when I was in Houston and up here in Washington calling for again and again and again, more focus on mental health. Mental health is one of the best investments that we can make. We need to increase our capacity for providing mental health services on campuses, because often in the K through 12 level, mental health services are wholly inadequate. And for a variety of other reasons, folks off campus find it very, very difficult to access good mental health care, in part because of the expense. One of the first things we can do, in addition to I think the easy part is providing the resources at the state level. The not so easy part is how do we normalize seeking mental health care and seeking counseling. One of the best supervisors I ever had a background in counseling, and he would always tell us everyone needs counseling. And that is so true, but we don't always need counseling in quite the same way. And that's where normalizing counseling, and you've probably heard folks talk about how we need to normalize it. And some of the ways I've tried to normalize it is when I've had students who come to me and talk to me about the issues they're facing, and I really think they would benefit from counseling. I tell them about my experience as a student going to counseling and my more recent experiences going to counseling, and offer to walk them to the counseling center and introduce them to some folks. And in one case, I even went into a counseling session just to kind of model, see, I can do it too, so you can. But when we talk about normalizing counseling and mental health care, we sometimes forget that depending on somebody's background, whether their national background, their faith background, cultural background, etc., taking that walk and stepping into what we usually think of as a counseling center, opening that door that says counseling center, can be a stretch. And so to overcome that, what we need to do is make sure that we're providing culturally appropriate counseling. We need more counselors who are trained to reach all constituents on our campuses. And so that culturally appropriate counseling may not be in the counseling center. It may be in another place on campus. So the counselors need to get out of those centers and meet students where they're comfortable. So, for example, some of our campuses here in Washington have really wonderful spaces for Indigenous students. And I spoke to one of our counselors who herself is Indigenous, and she meets students in one of those spaces. She finds is more appropriate, it's more comfortable, it allows Indigenous students to open up. That's an example of culturally appropriate counseling in terms of space. We might consider, for example, on our campus, we have a meditation center that's used quite a bit by Muslim students. It may be appropriate, and again, we'd have to seek the student input on it, for counselors to meet in a space like that. But that's one of the chief ways that we can work toward normalization, is not simply encouraging people to go there, but having counseling come to us, have counseling come out of that office and meet people in spaces where they don't typically.
Sorry to cut you off, but we wanted to leave some time for questions, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. If you have any questions, please.
If I do want to introduce two brief things, and then I'm glad to take questions. We also, and this is where student leaders are very important. I've seen throughout my career that if you want something changed quickly, students working together demanding change often get that change. Student voices are frequently the most powerful on campus, and they can move presidents to take action. I've seen it again and again. So look at your incident management apparatus on your campus. Do you have clear conduct policies? Do you have clear policies on speech? Do you educate on a regular basis so students are aware of those and understand them? And is there education about civility and civil dialogue? Do you have effective BIT teams or behavior intervention teams? Do they actually work closely with law enforcement, security in a way that is not punitive, but is developmental? And also, I recommend calling for a campus climate response team. That's a group of folks on campus who are trusted and trained and committed to DEI values, who will hear complaints and concerns about campus climate that may not rise to the level of bias incidents. And then finally, I really call people to what I call radical inclusion. And radical inclusion is not so radical if you think about it, because number one, it means walking the talk. If you look at a lot of our campus values around inclusion, the language is there, but the practices often are not. In order to make that language come alive, it's not just the administration or faculty or staff or student leaders who need to practice this and walk the talk. We all do, all the time. This has to be the way we function together in our campus communities. We need to embody these values, such as belonging, of our institutions. Also, we need to do the hard work of inclusion, and that means embracing and connecting with the most difficult folks that we sometimes run into, the folks that we really would rather not, engage and embrace, because we know it's going to be a challenge, and maybe there's some incivility there, but we respond with civility. We respond with compassion, and we always seek to make people feel that they belong, even when it's difficult for us, because that's going to move the needle on belonging for everyone. Speak up and advocate for those who are marginalized, but at the same time, seeking their guidance in doing so, and keeping in mind that phrase, nothing about us without us. And finally, a radical commitment to civil dialogue, that no matter what someone says to us, we are going to respond with civility and compassion. But yes, I'd be glad to answer some questions.
If you have any questions, please drop them in the chat.
Beta, Kathleen from Clover Park has a question in the chat from earlier.
Sorry, I'm just trying to find it.
Let me share it. What can we do to make our campus feel safe for everyone during the presidential election season for different cultures?
That's a tall order, but it's doable. Number one, keep in mind the difference between making a space safe and then helping people get to a point where they are free from fear. There's always that gap. But number one, particularly for folks who are not familiar with the electoral process, as well as not familiar with some of our recent campaigns, educate, talk about it, make sure people are informed of how that process works, and start having the discussions soon, like the start of winter quarter. I would recommend begin having events and discussions around the election and how to be a critical consumer of media, for one thing, but also how to be supportive when you hear or you see some material in the media that is going to be hurtful for others. Think of it in terms of it's going to be constant micro and sometimes macro aggressions in that sense that folks are experiencing. One of the ways we can counter that is not by reacting back to what we read in the media, because some of that is unfortunately going to continue, except depending on how our votes influence that in the long term. But sometimes the best response when you can't interrupt a microaggression is to respond to the targeted person with a micro affirmation. So we respond to the negative with positive. And we are the ones who help to kind of alleviate that burden by reminding folks that we're here, we're listening, that on our campus, that sort of speech doesn't have a space, depending on what your policies are on campus, and that we are going to respond by making those folks feel that they belong. But I think that informing people of the process is so important, and then being ready in advance with supportive initiatives and outlets for discussion when the election finally gets here is very, very important, rather than scrambling after the fact to respond.
Alrighty, thank you so much. That was a great presentation. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very, very much. There's one question. How do we make people feel and heard and understood, even if it might make us feel uncomfortable at times? Yeah, that's a challenge. And some people are in a place where, depending on the issue, it's just not, you're not able to engage sometimes because it's some things that you run into can be a trigger. So you really have to be aware of what your limitations are, and where, for example, you may have privilege to step out and really engage something that can be uncomfortable, but because of your background, because of your experience and your knowledge, you feel confident you can do so. So one of the things to remember is that you don't have to like somebody to treat someone with respect. And it'd be nice if more people would remember that about us too. You don't have to like somebody to engage in civil dialogue. And who knows, in doing so, you might find, as I have at many times in my life, that you start to make a new friend. But this notion of radical commitment to civility is part of that process. So embrace the values of civility and belonging, and trust that by walking that talk, it has it's like a constant irritant at wearing down that incivility. You're setting an example because people are always watching how we respond. And when you respond in anger, for example, that's going to feed more anger. If you respond with civility, you're setting an example for how to do it. And very often I've seen situation after situation where other people will step up and assist in responding where that's appropriate.